You want to be careful if you're dealing with the left hand of God. Much more difficult. I'm going to talk about one of our themes for the month, which is reaping what we sow. And when we think about that, we think about, am I echoing a lot now? It sounds like it to me.
Yeah. A little bit.
I'll turn this on. I don't know if that has any effect. But, okay. We tend to think about reaping, about getting in. But when you think about reaping what you sow, you need to start with thinking about sowing. And to sow is to scatter seeds, to plant seeds. And that's what we do with manifestations, of course. It's planting spiritual seeds to grow. And when we think about that, as I try to develop that, I think you have to go back to looking at what is our interaction with the universe first. That's going to determine the whole concept of reaping and sowing. And so we start with the idea, we all think constantly, I think, of how the universe, how the things around us affect us. And they affect us in many ways. But we forget many times how strongly we affect the universe as a whole. From the moment we're born, the little one back there, from the moment we're born, we affect physical space. We think of space around us, we think of time as just things that are there and we're in them. And they're set. But we know that that's not true. Relativity theory has shown us that matter, and speed affect space and time. They're not set things at all. They stretch, they shrink based on the matter that's around them and the speed that it's going. Now, normally you only think of that in the biggest terms. Stars warp space, planets warp space. But the reality of it is that it's true for every aspect of matter, every piece of matter. And so when we're born, as this little baby who comes out, space and time is changed. Just an infinitesimal amount. But our very essence, our very being, changes the space and time around us. But it's much more than that. We've talked about that before as we develop in consciousness. Again, one of the most successful theories in science is quantum theory. Our computers, our iPhones, all of the technology around us wouldn't work without the concepts of quantum theory. And yet, what quantum theory says is that material things, matter, doesn't exist in a set form. A proton is not anywhere. A proton is not anywhere within space and time. It's a probability. It's not that we don't know where it's at. It's that it is not at a particular place. It's around. It has a probability of being places. And only when we consciously determine that it's there, when we consciously measure it, does it take on a specific space, a specific speed. And we've talked about this before, that matter can exist, or the universe exists, as both matter and waves of energy. And at first scientists thought, well, at different times it changes from one to the other. But then they realized that's not true. It is both all of the time, even though that's quite impossible by most theories. But when does it become specifically one or the other? When we choose to measure it. So if we measure it in a way that will measure matter, it will be matter. If we measure it in a way that measures energy, it will be energy. And even more than that, we can set up a situation where it has to divide and it has to become either energy or matter at that point. And we can set up the measurement later and we'll determine which it was in the past. Our effect on reality is incredible. But one thing about that, think of all of this, and I've spoken of all of these before. Nothing in any of that says that we created anything. There is no science whatsoever that says that we create anything. We change its form. We can determine, is it here or is it just a probability? Is it space or is it time or is it energy or matter? That space and time warp, but we're not creating anything new. All energy was created at the Big Bang, and that's what here. We determine at times what condition it takes. And if you think about that in the idea of seeds growing things, that's true too. You know, you take a kernel of corn, this little thing that's 1/4 of an inch, and you put it in the ground, and later you have an 8-foot corn stalk with corn ears on it. And it kind of seems like somehow that little teeny kernel of corn became this huge stalk, but that's not true at all, of course. The kernel of corn has a blueprint in it, and it has a way of changing the dirt and the water from the condition they're in into a stalk of corn. So it's not that the seed from very small suddenly all in itself becomes something very big, but rather that the seed has the blueprint in it that changes the material around it into something new, into this corn stalk. And that's what we do with our seeds of thought. We're not creating something new. We're changing the conditions of what is. But you'll note too, no two corn stalks are exactly alike. No two rose bushes, no two trees are exactly alike. Now, why is that? There's two factors here. The seeds have slightly different blueprints in them. But also, they pull in different materials. Even two corn plants right beside each other, they'll pull in slightly different materials, slightly different minerals, slightly different amounts of water. So what creates different plants, even of the same kind, is that the original blueprint is slightly different, the original seed, and then what they pull in from around them, how they change the material around them, comes out with different plants. And so with us, it's the same thing. We have thoughts, but none of our thoughts are the same. No two of us have the same thoughts. If we think of a new job or a new house or a new friend, your thought on that and my thought on that will not be exactly the same. I mean, if you think of getting a new job, and I think of getting a new job. If I think of getting a new job, I think of a job that pays a tremendous salary and I don't have to do anything whatsoever. I don't know if that was the thought you had. And so our thoughts start out different, but the field we plant them in is different. Now I know we think, well, we plant them in the spiritual field. Spirit is eternal. It's infinite. How would we say that it's different? But remember, eternal and infinite doesn't mean the same. And remember, again, the Master Jesus talked about planting that seed and talked about planting it in rocky soil and it wouldn't grow, or planting it among weeds and it gets choked, and then planting it in good soil where the good crop grows. And so let's look at those two things. Our spiritual thought seed and the spiritual field we planted in. So let's start with our thoughts. Now, if we want to manifest something, if we want to develop something, we have to have a clear, focused thought on it. You know, when our son Benjamin was young and he would play, he had a big box like this with all these toys in it. And much of the time, his idea of playing was to take out every single toy in the box and scatter it all around. And Gene would ask him, what are you doing? And he said, it's a festival. And he could just go from one to the other. And often that's how our thoughts are. We have an idea that we're going to do something, but we create thought festivals, and they just go all over the place. There were some studies done about attention span. You know, when we think of this, we think of ADHD and children with attention span problems. But these were just studies on normal attention span, which can be defined, obviously, in many ways. But this was just the focus on one concept. And in 2012, the average attention span for an adult in the United States was 12 seconds. Well, you think that's not good. In 2014, there's text, there's iMessage, there's Facebook, there's email. The average attention span is 8 seconds. Now, that doesn't seem too good. But let me tell you how bad it is. The average attention span for a goldfish is 9 seconds. You can look that up. You can find this information. So here we are going to focus this brilliant thought on things, and we have less attention span than a goldfish. So, if we want to plant spiritual seeds, we've got some work to do first. We've got to learn to focus and develop our mental skills. And of course, in truth, that's what a good practitioner does. A good practitioner doesn't have any kind of magic spiritual powers.
I beg to differ.
Well, I was going to say perhaps except for me, but I what a good practitioner can do is focus their thoughts. It's not anything real complicated. Focus the right thought. And so we can all learn to do that. We know through meditation, and there's many other ways to develop your ability to have strong spiritual thoughts. And that's the beginning of it. But what about the field? What about the spiritual field that we planted in? Again, we think of spirit as all being the same. It's everywhere, and it's everywhere, but that doesn't mean all the same. Remember, there can be only one law. We've talked about that before. And we know that that law is a spiritual law, and the physical laws don't exist separately. You don't have a spiritual world that's separate than a physical world. So the physical laws must reflect the spiritual laws. And we've already noted that in the physical world, we affect it constantly. Just by being there, we warp the space and time around us. With every thought, we can change things from matter to energy, etc. And so we're all changing the spiritual field around us. And when you're planting that seed, it's being affected by the spiritual field you planted in. The laws of reality, of how reality works, say that that's what must be happening. And so let's look at it. You've worked and worked and worked and developed and focused your mind, and you plant this great thought, and then you tell with this person, and they're very supportive and very positive, and it's making a good spiritual field. But you tell these other people, the same people you go gossiping with periodically, and the same people that you complain about things periodically, and you tell them, and they're thinking, oh, that's never going to work. And they're thinking, it should have done it a different way. And they're thinking, things go wrong all of the time. And that spiritual field around you is being warped and changed. And the thought that's going to grow is not that one pure thought you put in, but the thought that's drawn its energy from this warped spiritual field around it. And we see that happening around us constantly. And that's why a place like the POC